No, ako mati. Kuha na niya.
And your positive attributes if you're Asian.
Ladies and gentlemen, we say that as a minority group, we have to create a space to be that is able to accept all kinds of people within our own community. We have to understand that there's like a large spectrum of people within like the Asian community in and of itself. We said that we should not generalize these kinds of things. We said that even if there is going to be like a positive myth, we say regardless it's something that is bad, and I'm going to prove to you that in my speech. But what is it that we want under side opposition, right? We want to like not embrace these kinds of like positive myth. And what is that we're going to do is that we're going to create a counterbalance. So as like a movement, for example, we are going to continuously like highlight like, for example, an African American individual that is being successful outside of like being an athlete, for example. Or we are going to highlight artists like Rich Brian, for example, in which he is like an Asian that does not like conform to the usual like idea that we have that Asians have to be like a successful mathematician, for example. We say that these are the kinds of things that we're supporting. We say that we want to create this safe space for those who cannot fit into these kinds of standards. So let's move on to my first argument as to why, regardless of like whether or not the myth is a bad or like a good thing, we say that inherently it's something that is bad. Firstly, we have to understand as to where this myth came from and why it happens to begin with, right? We say a lot of this myth happened from people outside of our society, right? People that doesn't understand what is actually happening, and most likely a lot of this myth came from like the interaction of a white person to like their Asian friend, for example. We say that these kinds of like interaction eventually does not lead to like the representation of the ethnic minority in and of itself, right? We say that these kinds of things are heavily inaccurate, and it's simply bad exactly because it's not able to actually like represent our movement as a whole. We say that because of like this kind of like source, it's not something that we should use as a way to represent ourselves. Exactly, also because it's a very like small understanding of what our community actually is and what our community is actually capable of doing. Right? We say that, and we also have to understand that in a lot of these instances, there's like in a lot of these instances, these kinds of like myths and stereotypes are being used as a way to actually like to continuously like oppress the minorities in and of itself, right? We say that this is something that is inherently bad, right? We have to understand that that a lot of these kinds of things can eventually lead to us having like an expectation that an Asian has to be smart in math, right? That a lot of that African Americans have to be like successful, have to be an athlete in order to be successful. We say that these kinds of things are exactly the kind of like oppression that is going to happen under side government. We say that at the end of the day, it's only going to like continuously harm people within our community, because it's going to be like very hard for like Asians, for example, who actually excel in art, but they cannot be appreciated, and they're not even going to like accepted in their community, because this is not the idea that that people actually use in order to accept Asians to begin with. Right? We say that at the end of the day, all of these things are eventually bad, and the other thing that we also have to understand is how this then change like the function of like African American community in and of itself. For example, we say that the moment we see like African Americans as like people who are like only capable of like being strong, for example, that's exactly the moment in which we are going to continuously like have this kind of like perception. We say that under their side of the house, there's not going to be any kind of counterbalance. We say that these kinds of perception is eventually bad, right? But now let's actually move on to like my second argument in regards to like the actual impact of us having these kinds of perception towards the ethnic minorities, right? We say that Firstly, we have to understand that there's people within the community that have different kinds of struggles, right? We say that there are some people who just simply can. We say that there's just like some people, some Asians, for example, who are just simply dumb at doing science. We say that these kinds of things. Are not being recognized the moment that we are going to have these kinds of stereotypes, right? We say that a lot of these people will eventually be like left out from their community exactly because there's only like this one idea that you have to be in order for you to get accepted to begin with, right? We say that at the end of the day, what's going to happen is that the moment you do want to be accepted within our within the majority, for example, it's going to be much harder because you have to like fulfill all of these standards that are being imposed to you in order for you to not be seen as like a threat, for example. We say that at the end of the day, there's always going to be a continuous standards that are simply not realistic for every single ethnic minorities to actually be, right. But then secondly, let's talk about like the psychological harm that is being caused towards like the people within like the minority group in and of itself, right. We say that this kinds of things is like a kind of like oppression, right. We have to understand that this goes to the level in which, like, for example, Asian kids are being extremely stressed because like their parents always force them to like study like science, for example. We say that this eventually like disables them from actually like improving themselves in fields they're not very in fields that they actually excel at, but they simply cannot just because of the perception that is being continuously continuously pushed on them, right? We say that so what is the actual result of this, right? We say that there's a lot of kids eventually that do want to be like successful in like music, for example, but their parents will just like simply not say anything to them, right? But what is that we have to understand is that there's a lot of like problems that can be exclusive to a certain race. For example, African Americans. We have to understand that in the current status quo, there's always like a continuous expectation that they have to be like people who are strong, right? We say that because there is like this this stereotype that African Americans are like stronger people, that's exactly the moment in which they can be furthermore harmed. How is that so? Let's take a case of like, for example, the moment that an African American is doing crimes, for example, doing pickpockets. We say that these kinds of crimes are not necessarily something that is that's very big, right? But because we continuously have this expectation that they are like very strong individuals, that's exactly the moment in which police, for example, are going to have like this sense that they have to protect themselves from these black people. We say that a lot of these things can eventually lead to like them being like furthermore harmless, for example, being like shot, for example. We say that all of those things eventually leads to furthermore oppression. We say it's much better for you to accept your identity. So proud to close.